But I thought that a bunch of the kind of neurological weirdness that I was experiencing was from carb, highs and lows. But then I wore a continuous glucose monitor, and I would feel like, and I was like, well, my blood sugar is great. Like, it didn't change at all. And then it took a while to put it together, but I would take some electrolytes and then I felt fine. I was like, oh, I'm sodium deficient, and that was more the problem.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow. Welcome to this episode of the Undercurrent Podcast. I am very excited to have Robb Wolf joining us. And in this episode, we're going to shift gears from more of our clinical concepts and talk more generally about nutrition, especially electrolytes, and talk about strategies that we can use to support overall health of the body and specifically the brain and nervous system. And part of the reason I'm so excited to have this conversation with Robb is his background. He was a research biochemist, and he's turned into a prolific author and teacher. He has two New York Times bestselling books, The Paleo Solution and Wired to Eat, and also a recent book that I love. It's on my bookshelf right behind me called Sacred Cow, which explains how well-raised meat is healthy both for us and for the planet. To give you an idea of what he's been up to in his career in other areas too, he co-founded the first and fourth CrossFit gyms in the entire world. He's an accomplished jiu-jitsu and powerlifting competitor, and he's also the co-founder of one of my favorite companies called Element or LMNT. If you're watching the video, you can see me holding up one of these salt packs here, one of these electrolyte packs. So we'll definitely talk about these. I absolutely love these, and we'll start there. So welcome to the show, Robb.
Huge honor to be here. Thanks.
So let's start with the concept of electrolytes and these salt packs. Obviously, you started this company to get more electrolytes into the world, so you feel strongly about it. Can you let us know why minerals are so important and what some of the biggest misconceptions are around electrolytes, especially salt, and then of course what you're doing to correct those misconceptions?
Yeah, it's interesting because looking back 5 years ago, I would have never in my life thought that I would be hawking salt to people. It's like, seemed like a total red ocean, like, the world needs another electrolyte product, like it needs, another pandemic or something like that. And what was interesting is that in fiddling with my own health, I've generally eaten on the lower carb side of things for 23 years now, and generally motor along pretty well. Like, my cognition is good. Most of my physical performance is good, but because I do some jujitsu and CrossFit type stuff, that low carb fueling isn't a perfect fit for that, because these are pretty glycolytic activities. And I would try cycling carbs and post-workout carbs and pre-workout carbs and all this stuff. And it helped a little bit, but it really didn't tick the, all the boxes. And I just kept tinkering with this. And I found a couple of guys, Tyler Cartwright and Luis Villaseñor, who are the founders of this program called Keto Gains. And they're just remarkably successful helping people do these amazing body composition transformations. And they have some people competing at high levels in like CrossFit and jiu-jitsu and powerlifting, and they're all keto fueled. I was like, what are these guys doing? Like, what are they doing that I'm not aware of? And so I started basically kind of stalked Tyler and Luis and started hanging out with them and had them look at what I was doing. And the long and short is that they were like, your protein, carbs, fat are fine, but you're really deficient in electrolytes, specifically sodium. And I was like, well, I salt my food. I'm fine on that. And they're like, and their head probably almost rolled off their shoulders. Like they rolled their eyes so hard, I'm sure, but they're kind, benevolent people. And so they let me flounder around for another 6 months to a year. And I just kept complaining about, poor performance and all this. And they're like, no, really, you need more sodium specifically. So they laid this out. They're like, make sure that you take in this much sodium per day and tell us what happens. And it was magic, and of course, the guy who's selling salt is going to tell people that salt's magic. But the interesting thing about what we did there, it should have been so obvious to me, understanding low carb diets and low insulin leads to this process called the natriuresis of fasting, which is the loss of sodium and water when our insulin levels are low. Like, I knew about this, but I just hadn't really connected the dots. But this was clearly such a huge problem within this kind of paleo, keto, low carb, world, that I talked with Tyler and Luis. I'm like, hey, why don't we put together this guide for how people can make their own, electrolyte beverage, like use this much table salt, this much no salt, which potassium chloride, some magnesium citrate, some lemon juice, stevia, add water, shake it up and go. And we did that. And we still have that available for folks. But within 6 months, we had like 500,000 downloads to this thing. Like, it was crazy. And folks were just reporting that their sleep improved, their performance improved. When they would exercise, like, there were like 5 to 10 beats per minute lower at any given work output, which this is one of the challenging effects of low carb diets, is that the average heart rate tends to be higher, which can kind of cap your maximum cardiac output. Just ended up fixing all these problems. The main issue was that it was convenient if you were at home to mix all this stuff up, but very inconvenient if you were traveling or anything. So the folks that were downloading this guide said, hey, why don't you do some sort of a convenient stick pack option? And so we did. And so that's a long roundabout thing getting to, why are electrolytes important? Why is sodium specifically important? For a lot of folks, they really don't need to supplement sodium in their diets because they're eating a standard American diet, highly processed foods. They're getting more than enough sodium, and they tend to get an unhealthy level of insulin stimulation from the overeating and from the amount of processed carbs that they eat. But whenever folks make a shift towards a better quality of eating, and it doesn't have to be paleo or keto, it could be vegan, it could be like Mediterranean or what have you. But one of the things that happens inevitably is that people eat fewer processed foods. And when we eat fewer processed foods, that tends to be the primary source of sodium in our diet. And then folks end up in this kind of hyponatremic, low sodium state. And a lot of the, physical challenges, psychological challenges that people face when they do dietary and lifestyle changes are due to low sodium, ironically. Like, this is what you ultimately end up getting to if you dig into this stuff. And it's already really hard to affect diet and lifestyle change. But then if you stack the deck further, that it's almost like going through like a nicotine detox or something like that, because you're jonesing for salt and processed foods. Like, it's just really stacking the deck unfavorably for people. And we chatted a bit before recording. Literally all of life is driven by sodium potassium pumps. Most folks are familiar with ATP and the Krebs cycle and whatnot. And the end stage of all of that process is to drive sodium potassium gradients, which are, how we have nerve impulses and muscle contraction and all the rest of that. And it's worth noting that other than pH, electrolytes are probably the most tightly regulated physiological process in the body. I think you could argue one versus the other, but it's crystal clear that if pH gets altered, high or low, people can feel quite unwell and can die from that. And the same thing happens with electrolyte imbalances. And ironically, even though folks maybe get too much sodium in general from processed foods, the irony is that sodium is arguably the most important kind of keystone element to electrolyte intake, because if we are deficient in sodium, it's very, very difficult to make everything else work. People really focus on potassium. They focus a lot on magnesium. And those things are definitely deficient in the modern diet. Like when we're eating processed foods, we tend to not get enough of those. But interestingly, the way that the kidneys function, if we have adequate potassium, adequate magnesium, but inadequate sodium, it's hard for the kidneys to really get ahead of that and to really deal with that situation. But if the inverse is true, if we have adequate sodium and maybe a little bit deficient in potassium and magnesium, the kidneys can get on top of that and can motor through that. And it's actually the therapeutic versus toxic window for sodium versus potassium. Sodium is a much more forgiving chemical to overconsume before we have problems. If you overconsume potassium, it can make your heart stop. And this is what most lethal injections are, is a big bolus of potassium. It causes the heart to cramp, and that's it. So I know that was a long wandering, kind of expose on, electrolytes in general and why sodium's important, but that's a little bit of the backstory and a little bit of the physiology around why sodium and electrolytes are so important, and why sodium really is kind of the linchpin electrolyte that folks need to address if they want to deal with the headaches and the brain fog and the lethargy, to say nothing of cramping. Once people have gotten to the point of like toe cramps and, calf cramps and stuff like that, they're very far down the electrolyte deficiency kind of spectrum.
That's a fabulous overview. Thank you for that. And I think that the concept of energy is so important. We think about metabolic health and blood sugar. We think about mitochondrial function. We think of, and everything that we do, the deeper down we get, that is exactly where it goes. Like you said, the sodium potassium pump and that electrolyte, that gradient, charge gradient across every single cell is the actual mechanism by which we generate energy. And if we don't have enough for that to occur properly, then we are going to run out of energy. And that, we've talked on this podcast, and in my book, we talk a lot about the concept of we need to have enough energy to meet all of our basics for survival if we want to have any left over for long-term growth and repair, for building muscle, for repairing organs and various structures in the body, and for having higher level cognitive function, executive function. It's also important. So this really is the key to energy. Is there anything else, since we do talk a lot in that neurological realm, neuroplasticity, neurological based treatments, and fitness and performance enhancement, is there anything specifically in that realm, anything else that you think we need to talk about there regarding electrolytes, minerals, sodium, potassium, magnesium?
I think maybe just reiterating that everything that is an activity of interest, with regards to performance, health, and longevity, if we are trying to learn a new skill, the sodium potassium pumps and electrolyte status is huge. It becomes kind of fractal, like it starts folding in on itself. Our total allostatic load, our total stress load, will become a factor in our ability to adapt to a new stress or to imprint a new skill or something. Like, because I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I think about it more like a calculus class or a history class. Like, I'm learning stuff, and it's kind of funny that people don't really. There's not as much thought around like, what are we doing cognitively to enhance our skill development, versus like if you're in like an academic setting, people start thinking about nootropics and everything, and the nootropics should have a place in like physical activity, and proper neurological functioning is the most nootropic thing that you could really think of. So sleep is dramatically impacted with appropriate versus inappropriate electrolyte status. Our allostatic load, like the total stress load, is mitigated if our electrolyte status is on point. Just being able to function properly, whether you're doing a podcast like we are doing right now, or you're doing physical activity, a proper electrolyte status is a really big deal for kind of getting all that stuff right. So it's and again, the guy who sells salts is telling you salt's important. Like, we have a free downloadable guide for it. You don't have to buy our stuff. As part of the guide, we recommend eating olives and pickles and pickle juice and all these sodium rich foods to try to tick that box. And oh, by the way, if you need something convenient, then we have Element also. But it's funny, like we've chatted with folks like Lance Armstrong and some really high level performers that hydration and electrolytes have always been on their radar, but they never looked at it as like, this is actually the center of the bullseye gig because of that sodium potassium pump, kind of orientation. And we are kind of nosing around the proposition that a properly formulated electrolyte option is really the only. There aren't really energy drinks. Like a Monster isn't really an energy drink because it's a stimulant that's not producing energy specifically. That is sodium potassium pumps, ATP, all that type of stuff. So we're kind of nosing around that as a concept. So if you want to optimize energy, if you want to optimize allostatic load, if you want to optimize all these other inputs that go into neurological status like sleep and heart rate variability and whatnot, then the electrolytes and sodium are just so incredibly important. Like it's still 3 years into this company and really looking at this in a different way. It still kind of blows my mind how critical this stuff is, and it really bums me out that I didn't figure this out like 22 years ago when I was still youthful and had lots of physical upside ahead of me.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I think a couple of things come to mind hearing you say that. When you talk about how electrolytes are the bullseye, there's so many times in health and in life when we try to go on to the sexiest or the fanciest things, and we go down to step D and E, but we pass A, B, and C, and we skip the basics. And the best people in the world in any task, the best musicians still practice their scales. The best basketball players still practice their free throws. And I think we can't forget about the fundamentals, and it doesn't get more fundamental really than this. I'm so glad you said that. I'm also glad you brought up the concept of allostatic load. The adrenals, I think a really easy way to think about it is they deal with the 3 S's. They deal with sex hormones, stress hormones, and then also salt. So so if there's issues with salt and sodium levels, that is stressful on the body. That does increase the allostatic load or the overall stress load. So dealing with that, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that can have a huge effect on the autonomic nervous system and reduce our overall load or cumulative stress and challenge, and help us spend more time in that parasympathetic state, more rest and digest and recovery. So that's great. I'm so glad you brought that up. We've talked about why this is important, what electrolytes are. Let's go now even one layer deeper into the how. So how much do we need? How do we implement these? How do we actually go about making sure our electrolytes are on point and we're hitting that bullseye?
Oh man, it frustratingly, like the how much is maybe the least precise thing that I personally have going on in this story. You would love to be able to say, oh, you're a 6'2" male, 205 pounds, your physical activity is this, and we know that you need this much sodium per day. But what we've seen is, there are genetic factors, there's environmental factors. So one thing that we can do, it's very, very difficult to give people like a pinpoint answer to this stuff. And it becomes a little bit subjective, where you just kind of have to check the wind and, see, am I feeling pretty good, and go from there. But heat and humidity increase electrolyte needs, physical activity increases electrolyte needs. Interestingly, cold weather can increase electrolyte needs, particularly, people go skiing and they don't realize that they're at altitude and the air is very, very dry. And the double, kind of whammy within cold environments is that you just don't want to drink fluids, like our natural, sense of thirst tend to get down regulated in the, cold environments. So those are all things that factor in kind of environmentally. On kind of a genetic and epigenetic level, we have certain folks, mainly males, although some females fall in this category of being called super sweaters, where they just pour sweat, and it's so they will produce about double the amount of sweat of other people. And not only do they produce more sweat, their sweat is saltier. So, we've done some work with some NHL teams, and they will track how much sweat these guys produce they're about 200, 210 pounds, pretty big athletic guys. And in the course of a hard practice or a game, these guys can lose 10 pounds of water and 10 grams of sodium. So 10 grams of sodium lost during a game, and our medical guidelines suggest we should consume less than 2 grams of sodium per day to be healthy. So this is kind of where we end up jamming up, against medical recommendations versus reality. So in a couple of different ways, we generally bracket sodium recommendations somewhere between 5 grams at a minimum up to 10 to 12 grams, depending on an individual's needs and their physical activity levels, size, and whatnot. But instead of being able to give a really pinpoint accurate, like you need this much per day, usually what we recommend is that folks just kind of hydrate to a point that they feel good. And then if they start noticing brain fog, lethargy, fatigue, certainly cramping, like cramping is an indicator that they are really far down the electrolyte deficiency, kind of path, but about 5 grams minimum per day for most folks, especially if they are eating a minimally processed diet, which means they're not getting much sodium from the diet for the most part, unless they're doing specific things like olives and pickle juice and stuff like that. So a minimum of 5 grams up to as high as 10 to 12 grams per day for most folks. And I'm trying to think if there's any other consideration there.
And
yeah,
just
I mean,
just to reiterate, so the medical recommendation is not to exceed 2 grams a day.
Right.
And you're saying most people, regardless of activity, need at least 5, and it can increase from there, 5 grams, and it can increase from there depending on sweat, depending on activity, depending on how hot it is, etc.
Correct.
So that's already a fairly big difference.
Yeah. And for that high motor athlete, if he or she is trying to diligently follow American Medical Association, American Dietetics guidelines and stay under 2 grams of sodium per day, but is bleeding 10 grams of sodium per day, that will cause the person to feel awful. They will transiently be in these hyponatremic, low sodium states. The body can adapt to that. And what it does is it pulls sodium out of the bones. But what it also pulls out of the bones at that time is calcium. So this is one of the big drivers of osteoporosis, osteopenia, is low sodium intake, interestingly. So this is also where a blood test for sodium, potassium levels, electrolyte levels in general, it's a bit of a snapshot, and it can be helpful. We had a cat go into the vet with something nobody knew what was wrong with it. And so you check electrolyte levels, and the electrolytes were within reasonable bounds for that moment. Okay, so that overtly isn't, one of the causes of the cat having problems, but we don't actually know. This is a movie, not a snapshot. Does that cat consume adequate sodium every day, all the time? Same thing with us. So it's important to really make sure that we're getting adequate sodium levels dietarily, because it won't be immediately obvious that we're deficient in sodium or electrolytes in general, because we do have some compensatory mechanisms. Again, though, based off of activity level, we may go in and out of having really severe problems, like you're doing a hard workout or you're doing a game like ultimate frisbee game or something like that, and your energy just tanks, you're feeling lethargic. You maybe think that it's a blood sugar dysregulation issue, which is what I did for years. Like I don't handle carbs great. Like I definitely feel better on the lower carb side of things. But I thought that a bunch of the kind of neurological weirdness that I was experiencing was from carb, highs and lows. But then I wore a continuous glucose monitor, and I would feel like shit. And I was like, well, my blood sugar is great. Like it didn't change at all. And then it took a while to put it together, but I would take some electrolytes and then I felt fine. I was like, oh, I'm sodium deficient, and that was more the problem. But yeah, again, sorry, I know I'm bouncing around a lot, but at least 5 grams of sodium per day for most folks. if somebody is a type 2 diabetic, hypertensive, they know that they have high blood pressure, they probably don't need to diligently add sodium to the diet. But interestingly, low sodium diets don't really help that situation either. There are great randomized control trials that look at that, and low sodium diets really don't move the needle much on blood pressure, high blood pressure, and hypertension. What folks really need to do is modify their calorie and carbohydrate intake so that they have a lower insulin level, so that they have normal blood pressure. This is kind of one of the side effects or hidden features of lower carb diets, even kind of a Mediterranean type diet, is that we tend to see really phenomenal normalization of blood pressure relative to eating a standard American or Western type diet.
Have you picked up your copy of the NuFit Method yet? In this book, Garrett helps you reconnect with the nervous system and improve outcomes at every stage of rehab and fitness. Based on Garrett's proprietary NuFit methodology and newbie technology, the solutions in this book will introduce you to a framework for overcoming virtually any physiological challenge. Take the first step in enhancing recovery, boosting performance, and optimizing health in ways you never thought possible. Now available on Amazon in hardback, paperback, or Kindle. And now back to the show.
That's great information. So if I'm someone who's listening to this and I'm not hypertensive, I don't have any of those concerns, and I'm thinking, okay, I want to try adding in some more sodium to my diet. I'm going to start with 5 grams. I'm going to, I feel good. I'm going to try 6. I'm going to try 7. You mentioned sodium can be forgiving, that to the point where we don't, we're not like too concerned about, getting too much. But at some point, if let's say I go to 10, 12, 13, 15 grams, is there a point at which I'll notice some negatives, or where something, what would be the sign that I have overconsumed it, even if it's forgiving? How do I, I don't want to go too far.
Yeah. For most people, you get disaster pants if you go too far. So it will be immediate and pretty obvious. And so you get,
so that's a friendly way of saying diarrhea.
Diarrhea. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's interesting, with something like Element, or even when people are mixing a home brew or doing something like pickle juice, a salty beverage won't taste super salty if you need more sodium. Like it'll be kind of pleasantly, it'll taste pleasant, even something like pickle juice. But folks with regards to Element, especially if they have it diluted at that like 24 to 30, 32 ounces, they'll be sipping on it. It tastes sweet. It tastes sweet. It tastes sweet. And then they'll take a drink and it tastes salty. And they're just kind of like, I'm done. And salt is the only kind of micronutrient that we have an ability to taste. Like B vitamins have a flavor. Like if you crunch up a B vitamin, it has a flavor to it, but we're not biologically wired to be like looking for B vitamin or leucine or what have you as a dietary constituent, whereas a big chunk of our sense of taste is salt. Salt, sweet, sour, umami. And I think that there's some interesting kind of feedback mechanisms there, where when we need sodium, it's very pleasant to get exposed to a sodium source. And then when we've had adequate sodium, it's like, I'm good. Like I'm totally good on that. I don't need more. There's no randomized control trial that fleshes that stuff out, but there's, mechanistically, it makes sense. And there's a good amount of anecdote around this stuff. And I think that is, again, something that could be useful for people with regards to, do I have enough? Do I add too much? My good friend, Dr. Kirk Parsley, he lives in Austin, probably a neighbor of yours, but he is pretty sensitive to sodium on that like GI whoosh side. So he never really hits the point where it doesn't taste good. He'll top off, and then he's like, oh man, I hope I'm not driving when this thing goes. So I think that those are kind of the two mechanisms, like a taste mechanism. When it really starts tasting salty and kind of unpleasant, then I think that we're probably good. And especially then if we kind of internally inventory, like, do I have any brain fog? Do I have any type of cramping? Do I have generally good energy levels, and like my focus and whatnot is good? If all those things are in place, and you're, like I've got a chocolate salt in this and it tastes good, but I've hit that point where I'm kind of like, I'm probably going to wait a little while, or I'm going to add some more coffee to it, to kind of top it off, because I think I'm at my fill. I had a raspberry with before breakfast, and then ate breakfast, and then mixed up some coffee with a little bit of cream and a chocolate salt in this one. And like, it's good, but I'm starting to taste the salt more and more. And so it's kind of like, okay, I think I'm done on that. And I feel pretty good right now. Like, I'm definitely not cramping. I don't feel like I have like a hypoglycemic event. I feel like my brain is, chugging along at a decent clip. And so I have both that more direct, objective experience of this is tasting saltier as I go along, and then also that subjective, piece of like, well, I'm feeling pretty good, and my cognition's pretty on point, and all that stuff.
That's great. And I can tell you from my own experience that is, or tell you that my own experience is very consistent with that, where I'll be drinking it, and usually after a few salt packs at some point in the day, it just won't taste as good.
Yep.
And I haven't gotten to the disaster pants point yet, but
I apparently am, even though I have all kinds of weird GI stuff in general, like I can take this stuff super concentrated, which can be problematic. I can do loads of it. Like I seem to be whoosh proof, at least with the levels that I've tinkered with thus far. Yeah,
that's good. So you mentioned raspberry salt, chocolate salt. So these are a couple of the flavors of these LMNT salt packs. The one I have in front of me is actually an unsalted. That's what I have in here. And can you talk to us here, because this is an interesting topic, and I know you know something about it, and I think it has a lot of good educational value for our listeners. Can you talk to us about the sweeteners that you use in that? And then talk about sugar versus stevia versus artificial sweeteners in general, and the effect on health and the effect on blood pressure. I know that's like a 2 or 3 layered question there, but can you tell us a little bit about why you use what you use, and then more broadly about sweeteners and the health and blood sugar ramifications?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a biochemist by training, and I'm really honestly pretty underwhelmed with the scare factor around a lot of artificial sweeteners, like asulfate K and sucralose and stuff like that. A lot of those cause GI problems. It's kind of the main concern that I have. Like, people are like, oh, it's going to give you cancer. I'm like, I don't think that's going to give you cancer. It may give you the trots. A lot of artificial sweeteners have potential GI ramifications. Even some of the like natural sweeteners, erythritol, maltitol, those sorts of things that are used in like sugar-free chocolates and stuff like that. Like, if you grab a box of sugar-free chocolates and eat half of it, like you'll pray for death. Like, you will be shitting so hard and so vigorously. Like, you will wish that there was arsenic in that stuff. So there's challenges with all these things. We ended up going with stevia, and like, there are some folks that are super concerned about some studies that suggest that stevia is problematic from like a hormonal perspective. The studies that have been done in animal models around stevia that suggest that it may be problematic with hormones, it's just gargantuan amounts of stevia. Like, you would need to consume the equivalent to something like 30,000 boxes of element, which each box has 30 stick packs. So I mean, you would die far sooner from the sodium, the potassium, like all the other stuff than the stevia would be problematic there. So, but you held up the raw unflavored, and the reason why we did that is we knew, regardless of what sweetener we picked, somebody somewhere would have take issue with it. They would have some problem with it. Like, some people hate monk fruit, some people hate stevia. So it's like, okay, here's the raw unflavored. If you want to flavor it yourself, you can. We still have our make it yourself homebrew at drinkelement.com/homebrew. So if you want to do it 100% your own way and use your own mystical, Celtic sea salts and everything, you can do it that way. But the stevia just seemed like the least problematic, and also honestly it provided the best flavor overall for what we were trying to do. Like, people comment often that the flavors are really, really good, and they're not overly sweet, and you don't really get the stevia taste out of the, it's not that weird kind of bitter aftertaste with it. But again, we offer a couple of options, the homebrew option and then the raw unflavored. And then, on the sugar side of this stuff, it's interesting because if you follow some of the like evidence-based nutrition folks, which, for them, if there's not a randomized control trial, then it doesn't exist, even though there's no randomized control trial on the microwave background of the universe. We have arrived at most of our models of cosmology, geology, not via randomized control trial, but by inference, which is a whole other, funny thing. But, these folks will point out rightly that if we live in a metabolic ward and we are fed an isocaloric diet, so we don't overeat a diet that is very rich in sugar, there's no problems. Like, at least under the short term, like, people don't suffer undue metabolic health, they don't gain weight, that the real crux of that stuff is over consuming calories. Fine. Nobody lives generally in a metabolic ward, though. We live in these dynamic situations where you go into a 7-Eleven and there's something like 11,000 different food-like items in there, all of them engineered to bypass the neuroregulation of appetite. Like, they are engineered for us to want to eat all of them. And you could have a salty, crunchy thing here, and then a sweet, sour thing over here, and you just bounce back and forth between them. And that's my other book, Wired to Eat, talking about the neuroregulation of appetite. That's a difficult situation for modern humans to deal with. And I just, I think sometimes people go a little crazy, like they will have a good salad dressing that they're looking at. It's got like some balsamic, vinegar in it and some olive oil, and then maybe there's a little bit of sugar in it. Like, and at the end of the day, it's like a half a teaspoon per serving, and people will freak out about that. They're like, "Oh, I can't do it." And I'm like, I think that's maybe being a little bit over the top. But then at the same time, sugar is just in every damn thing that we get exposed to. So you also, one does need to practice a fair amount of diligence in minimizing our exposure to this stuff. I guess just generally avoiding, processed foods is kind of a strong argument there. Sugar is interesting to me in that, like, baked goods are a problem because they taste good and they're easy to overeat, and that's a problem. But some work that Robert Lustig did looking at fructose specifically, which this can be sucrose or high fructose corn syrup, but when we consume sugar in liquid form, it hits the liver at a remarkably fast clip. So the contents of our gut drain into the hepatic portal vein, and then that dumps into the liver. And we don't really understand why things work this way, but the exposure of the liver to liquid fructose causes some really interesting metabolic changes. It tends to encourage the liver to begin this lipogenesis process. So we begin developing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Now, this is a dose response curve. Like, if you had 5 grams of sugar in some other electrolyte product, that's not the problem. But it's so easy to get 20 or 30 or 100 grams of liquid carbohydrate in things like fruit juice, or, like people go into, again, convenience store and get a big gulp, or, something like that, where there's just mountains of sugar there. And there seems to be something going on metabolically that is different and much more dangerous and nefarious than just the carbohydrate content itself. The fact that it's liquid, the fact that it hits the liver so quickly seems to have some really negative metabolic consequences there. And so those are the reasons why we opted for stevia, and also why we have a raw unflavored, for the people that, know those sweetener was ever going to make those folks happier, tick all the boxes. And I know we're going to touch on like some ironclad takeaways, here at some point in the show. And one of those things is just avoid liquid carbohydrates like the plague. Like this seems like such an easy one that anybody, whether, paleo or vegan, although the vegans like juicing a lot. And so that may be, kind of problematic, but liquid carbohydrates are really problematic. They're very easy to overdo. And I think that they disproportionately negatively impact liver metabolism and skew it towards this pro-inflammatory, adipose accreting, process. Like it just stacks the deck towards becoming fat, but not just fat in generally, but that visceral adiposity, the fat that it, surrounds our internal organs and is so incredibly injurious to health and pro-inflammatory and whatnot.
There's a lot of great information there. If we can try to, reflect back and summarize. So you're not as concerned about the health ramifications of moderate amounts of artificial sweeteners, or even sugar alcohols, artificial lab-made artificial sweeteners, stevia, whatever it is, and you think that there's kind of a natural feedback loop there because GI distress would be the main thing to watch out for.
Yep.
And then likewise, you're not overly concerned with moderate amounts of sugar unless it's both excessive sugar and specifically, or most emphatically, liquid sugar like soft drinks, fruit juice,
coffees, like sugary coffees and stuff like that. Yeah.
So what about the in-between case of like like smoothies that have blended fruit in it where you still have the fibers of the fruit? Do you feel the same way about that, or is that a little different because it's going to be a little slower somewhere in between?
In my experience working with people clinically, like in a gym, and then I sit on the board of directors of a medical risk assessment clinic. I'm the crazy guy that really thinks that folks should just chew their food. Like if you drink something, it's coffee, tea, water, maybe milk, or used to, like 1950s, like a thing of juice was like this big, it was it was like a shot glass, and if you drink alcohol in a shot glass and you have one, it's not that big of a deal. When you have 15 of them, then it becomes a problem. So I just don't see things like smoothies and shakes really sticking with people long term, with regards to satiety and mitigating hunger. Like when we eat adequate protein, we find the appropriate glycemic level for each of us, which is just playing around with like the amounts and types of carbohydrate that we do well with. And some people do better with a little more fat. Some people do better with a little bit more carbs, but it's all mainly whole, minimally processed food. Just magic happens with that. And the folks that I see that are just like, I'm just too busy to eat real food and I just have to have a shake. They're always kind of a hot mess. Like it's still almost always the person that's struggling with the body composition that they want. Occasionally we have somebody who's like a figure competitor, a bodybuilder or something, and a real high motor, and they supplement their diet with a shake here and there, and that's fine. But it's just really rare that I see someone who's just kind of average person who wants to be healthy, who wants to be lean and, kind of physically fit, that they benefit from a shake relative to even like a sandwich or something, like 2 pieces of bread, a whole lot of meat in between, a little bit of veggies. Like that is going to work better for you than blending something up and shooting it down. Like the same macro, 50 grams of protein, 40 grams of carbs, blah, blah, blah. Like that sandwich that you got to chew up is going to work better for you metabolically. And satiety, like the real trick with all this is that you eat in a way that you spontaneously reduce calorie intake to the level that you need, and I just don't see shakes ticking that box very well. And I could have made a ton of money selling, different types of shakes and stuff like that. But just ethically, I was really conflicted with it because in my clinical practice, I didn't see that type of stuff work well for folks. Some people it might, but like if somebody's continually struggling with the body composition that they want, and they feel like they're, they're always, they do a shake and then they're hungry afterwards and whatnot. Like, try just eating whole, real food.
And is the best way to know whether this is working for, for anyone listening to this, to know whether it's working for them individually? Is it basically how long they can go between meals before they feel hungry, how long that sense of satiety lasts? Is that
Thank
essentially
you.
the
Yes.
best indicator?
Yeah, I completely dropped the ball on that. Yeah, one should be able to eat a meal and go 6, 8, 10 hours without eating. And you may be hungry. You may be like, man, I really want to eat, but you're still functional. Whereas when we get those really high glycemic load foods that don't really stick with us, like a shake, usually an hour, 2 hours later, you're hungry again. And you may get into this kind of hypoglycemic valley where you're lethargic, shaky. We call it hangry, where you start getting hungry and angry at the same time. That's a great feedback mechanism for in general, is what you're eating appropriate for fueling you, properly. Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, you had essentially said that. I think we just want to wrap it up and put a nice bow on it. I think that is that definitely seems to be the best sort of indicator. And then, for people who want to look a layer deeper, you mentioned the use of a CGM, continuous glucose monitor. Is that kind of the next best, tool to look at the best tool to look at that next level of detail to see blood sugar swings? Would that be kind of the next place you'd go, or something else?
Either a CGM or just getting an inexpensive finger prick, blood glucose testing. And before, like with my second book, Wired to Eat, we have the 7-day carb test. And within that, what we recommend is that folks pick a battery of carbohydrates. They check their blood sugar before they consume the carbohydrate. They eat the carbohydrate, and then they check it 1 hour and 2 hours. Ideally, some people just do 2 hours, but that's another good way to kind of get some objective feedback on this type of stuff. But a lot of people, like my stuff was interesting when I did that finger prick blood testing. As an example, I had 50 grams of effective carbohydrate from rice. My wife had 50 grams, which is just 1 cup. It's not a ton. That a pretty standard serving. My wife does great with carbs. Like, her blood sugar never went above about 115 at 1 hour and 2 hour. Mine went to like 198. Like, I was in diabetic ranges, and I felt awful. Like, I had vision changes. I was hungry afterwards, like really, really hungry. So objectively, I knew that I was in that, carbs are not my best friend camp, but it was kind of cool to get that objective, feedback of the blood glucose testing. The CGMs are cool. The bugger with them, I guess, kind of twofold. You have to get a prescription for them. There are some outlets now that like levels that can hook you up with that, like they hook you up with a doctor, and they can get you a CGM for kind of personal testing. But also CGMs are good to show trends, but they're not as accurate at kind of pinpoint blood glucose levels. So that's where like the finger prick models are better for really knowing for sure what your true blood glucose levels are.
Good. That's good feedback. And I can definitely recommend wholeheartedly to anyone listening, Wired to Eat, the book that you mentioned there too. We only have a few minutes left, and I do want to get into one last topic that's near and dear to my heart. We actually just last week drove to a beef processor to pick up our family's cow that we have in the garage freezer here. So I love Sacred Cow and the work that you've done there around agriculture and the health benefits of grass-fed beef. Can you tell us in just a few minutes here? I know, high-level summary, whatever we can cover in a few minutes. Tell us about Sacred Cow, your thoughts on both the health of the planet and the health of our bodies, and how we raise meat can affect that.
Yeah, it's the best way. Like, I hate when folks, and I will it's like the vegan playbook where it's like meat causes cancer, it's terrible for the environment, and you're ethically a horrible human being if you eat it. Peace out, mic drop, done. And the bugger though is that that's a super compelling argument to be made. It's an elevator pitch, and it's completely devoid of any nuance or background. It's like, really, meat is the cause of cancer, and meat is the primary driver of climate change. And I'm really, like, I'm an amoral person if I eat meat. What about all the traditional cultures that have eaten meat since time immemorial? Native Americans are horrible because they eat bison, really? Like, it's just this interesting thing that kind of goes on from there. And it's not to say there aren't ethical, health, and environmental considerations of consuming animal products, but it's a pretty complex topic. And where the world is currently is in this really like meme fest, 15-second elevator pitch, treatment of so many things on the one hand. Then on the other hand, we have these opportunities for long form discussion, like Joe Rogan type podcasts that can go on for 3 hours and really go deep on various topics. And 10 years ago, Diana Rogers and I were talking about the need to write a book on this topic, addressing the health, environmental, and ethical considerations of a meat inclusive food system. And that's what we did. Both the book and there's a film. So like if you have somebody who's interested in this topic, and they're probably not going to read a 300-page book on it, but they might be open to a Netflix type documentary film. We have Sacred Cow, the film, which is quite good and covers all this in a different way, but largely the same things. But I guess what I would throw out to folks is, is it possible that the media and social media and government are not giving us the full depth and breadth of treatment of this highly complex topic? And if we ever experienced a situation in which the government, the media, and social media have given us kind of an infantilized, assessment of some sort of important but highly complex process, and I think like every day, all the time, COVID and fossil fuels and all kinds of things. Like as an example, I'll just point this out. Most people are aware that if they buy gasoline, oftentimes it will say may contain up to 10% ethanol, as an additive in that. The thought there is that we're somehow being green in quotation marks, by using ethanol because it comes from corn. Well, the interesting thing with that is that it costs more energy to make ethanol from corn than what we get out of it. The ethanol manufacturers don't drive their tractors and cars and trucks with the ethanol that they produce. They use gasoline and diesel, because the only way that whole thing works is subsidies, massive subsidization of the production of ethanol from corn to be used as a fuel, and it costs more than what you get out of it. And it's a huge fucked up boondoggle. And the people who make lots and lots of money off of it, like there might be a few like Iowa corn farmers that are listening to this and are like, fuck Robb Wolf, but they're not doing anything for the environment. They're not doing anything to reduce fossil fuel consumption. They're actually worsening it. This is actually worse for the environment overall. And that's a like completely out there, very well analyzed. Like this is a simple thing. Like if you want to offset fossil fuels and you're going to use something like ethanol, you need to get more energy out of the ethanol than what you put into it. That is not what happens. So that's just a for example. And I will suggest that like the notion that animal husbandry causes more greenhouse gas emissions than all of transportation, that's completely inaccurate. The notion that cows in particular use massive amounts of water as if it's stealing it from somewhere else, the truth behind that is that the water that's being accounted for there is the water that falls on grasslands as snow and sleet and rain and was going to fall no matter what. and has no other use other than to grow grass. Like, it's not being stolen from somewhere else. It's portrayed as if it is being stolen from somewhere else. Whereas like when we look at almonds, they're actually 98% of the water in almond use is pumped from below ground as groundwater that is not immediately easily replaceable. And that's actually a place that one could make a very credible argument about the environmental considerations of water usage around almonds, but nobody's concerned about that because it's a plant-based food. So those are a few of the things out there. Like when we finished that book, it was 600 pages and the editor whittled it down to 300. And I think they actually did a very good job on that. Like there was important stuff that we are releasing slowly, that got cut out, but it's a really complex topic. And so if people take this, climate change thing seriously, and I think they should, maybe starting with the film first to just kind of get a 2-hour exposure to, does this seem insane? Like, is what we're putting forward insane? Like, we have a story in there about a rancher based out of the Chihuahuan desert, where he has reversed 1 million acres of desert and turned it back into grassland by using holistic management and rotational grazing. And it's absolutely amazing. And if every other claim around holistically managed animals was false, and I don't think they are, but let's say they all are, but we were able to use animals to reverse desertification, and we have literally no other way to do that. Like, you don't plant crops in these areas to reverse desertification. You use holistically managed animals to reverse that. Places like the Sahara, the western states that are so dry and have turned into desert. There's a movie, and I know I'm running along here, but really quickly, there's a movie called Sea of Grass from like the 1930s, 1939. And it talks about the area between like Albuquerque, New Mexico, up to Las Vegas, over to Salt Lake City. That used to be a giant grassland. It is now a desert, and it's mainly like sagebrush. And this is sage is kind of the climax species in an area that's been desertified, but that area was overgrazed. And so this is another thing that's interesting to understand. Too many grazing animals on an area, particularly placed there the wrong way, like when they started putting in fencing, it changed the ability for animals to naturally move across the landscape, and it fed into a process of overgrazing. Then you can undergraze an area. These grasslands evolved with the grasses co-evolved with ruminants that consume the grasses. Many of the grasses, their life cycle is dependent on going through the intestinal tract of these ruminants. Other grasses need fires to go through the areas at various points to be able to make them all work. But the long and short of that is that we have horribly mismanaged these huge tracts of land that could be reducing a climate impact, that could be sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere, and could be producing high quality, nutrient dense food for people. And this is kind of the compare and contrast. And you just couldn't get a more stark reality here. Like, on the one hand, you have a future that all of our food is going to come out of a lab or a vat. It's like Impossible Food and Impossible Burger. And it's all the the technology darlings, and all of Silicon Valley loves these folks. And the flip side is that our food system needs to possibly look a lot more like something that from the late 1800s, with an integration of portable solar powered electric fencing and drones that take infrared scans of the grasslands to know which grass needs to be eaten at what cadence, and maybe some areas need to be watered and whatnot. So an integration of 21st century technology, but with a backbone primary of something that doesn't look too much different from farms from like 1600s to 1800s. And there's just something incredibly unsexy suggesting that the backbone of our food system should look more like the 1800s than George Jetson growing food in a vat.
It's so interesting how, like you mentioned, how stark the contrast can be, and how one group of people can adamantly blame grazing animals for creating carbon, when there's a very compelling case that them eating grass, creating manure actually helps with carbon sequestration, sequestering carbon. It's a tough word to say.
Yep.
And can actually be better for the planet. And I think you guys make a very compelling case. And it seems like that has to be part of the future. Not only is it not the problem, it's actually a big part of the solution. And it also comes full circle, because we were talking about how too much LMNT can give us disaster pants, and now cow manure is the
it's the solution. Yeah,
that's
yeah.
right. So I think now that we've come full circle, it's a good note on which to close. I know we're coming up on your availability here, but thank you so much, Robb. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on. For people who are interested, you mentioned the drinklmnt.com. So that's drink, then the letters lmnt.com/homebrew. We also have a special offer for anyone listening. If you go to drinklmnt.com/NeuFit, you can get a free pack of these electrolytes. They're gonna give you a sample pack of several flavors. I'm opening mine up right now. It's got I think what, 8 or 10 packs in there.
Citrus, raspberry, watermelon, lemon habanero, mango chili, chocolate. I think is that it? I'm forgetting one. I'm forgetting one in there somewhere.
That looks right. Raspberry salt. Did you say raspberry?
I may have forgot the raspberry. Yeah.
Raspberry, watermelon. Yeah. So go. I would encourage everybody who's listening, go get that. I think they just pay for shipping, right? But they get free.
Yep.
Yeah. So go check that out. It's a great gift. Thank you, Robb, and the Element crew from everyone there for gifting that to our audience. And man, I'd love to have you on again to finish the conversation about agriculture and beef and all that. We didn't even get into the health benefits and the differences of the grass-fed beef versus conventionally raised. And there's some in the meantime, before we get to have Robb on again, everyone, please, if you're interested at all in this topic, I do encourage you to check out Robb's and Diana's on Netflix, their documentary and the book Sacred Cow. Both
and sacredcow.info, I think. Let me double check that. Sacred Cow. It's Diana's website, but that's kind of our clearinghouse for, yes, sacredcow.info. Amazing material on that site. Like Diana does a really phenomenal job managing, curating all that information, just generates content constantly. And it's funny because some folks have been like, you guys are just getting money from big meat. And I'm like, a lot of what we talk about is not super friendly to like big meat. Like we're in this kind of weird spot where we've managed to piss everybody off. Like this is not the vegan greenwash, because and I don't want to pick on them too much, but if you see one of their documentaries, it's like, you will be skinny, you'll live forever, you'll be morally superior, you're going to save the planet, and there's absolutely no ifs, ands, or buts, no details around that. Like it's just this like tsunami of good. And there's kind of a reality that a scalable food system that could be here for 10,000 years, there's trade-offs to it. There's pluses and minuses. There's things that the really meat elitist people wouldn't like about it. There's things that the big ag wouldn't like about it. Well, there's things that the Silicon Valley tech moguls don't like, because they love things like Impossible Burger and growing meat in a vat, because they love the notion of food as intellectual property, food as IP, because they could own that IP. Bill Gates is now the largest owner of farmland in the United States. And he's a huge advocate of all of this fake meat stuff and, paints animal husbandry in this very negative light. And there's lots of money to be made both on the meat side and on the plant-based side. But there's a lot more money to be made on turning corn and wheat and soy into things that look other than corn and wheat and soy than there is meat and dairy. Like there's just so infinitely more money to be made there, and the ability to consolidate control of our food system. So yeah, I would love to come back on, like, really the talking protein, carbs, fat. I do it, but I've been doing that for 22 years. Like, the thing that really gets me out of bed in the morning is talking about this regenerative ag stuff and the, more systems-based approach to like healthcare issues and all that type of jive. So yeah, I would love to come back and chat more about that.
That's awesome. Well, I love the work you're doing across these. Yeah, I mean, like you said, wired to eat and macronutrients. I mean, it's cool to see how your career has evolved now with the element salt packs and agriculture. I want to acknowledge the work you've done. Thank you for all the contributions you've made and how graciously you share your time and knowledge and education. I've gotten to hear you speak and meet you at different events in the past, and just had wonderful experiences and learned a lot from you. So it's great to have you on. Thank you so much. And you mentioned sacredcow.info. We mentioned your book and website. Your Instagram is Das Robb Wolf with DASROBB with two B's and Wolf, right? And then
I may be abandoning all social media soon.
Yeah.
I'm noodling. I may have a Substack and I may abandon it all because I think that social media as it stands right now is like this evil poison that is liable to literally destroy the world. I also get that it's kind of the only way to build a business and have reach. And so I'm conflicted on that, but I'm seriously thinking about shutting it all down and just going to a Substack. So we'll see. I may be a graded process, but yeah, at Das Robb Wolf. At a minimum, though, I'm going to shift most of my like broadcast type stuff onto just my own podcast and then the Substack. Yeah.
Okay, very good. So we'll find your podcast. So go on Spotify, on iTunes, just search Robb Wolf and it'll show up there.
Yep.
And Robb with two B's.
Yes. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for Robb for joining us. Thanks everybody for tuning in and listening. drinklmnt.com/NeuFit if you'd like the free gift. Get those 10 or so, 8 or 10 salt packs, and I love them. I have them every day. They've done wonders for me. Sustained energy, helping me be able to go longer in between meals. My HRV scores are higher when I have them. I mean, everything just works better. And like you, things were going fairly well for me, but it's definitely helped. It's made a noticeable jump. So I really think getting down to the fundamentals like that, like we talked about, is the key to sustainable success in any area, including health. And I just thank you so much for coming on and sharing that message.
Huge honor. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We will see you on the next episode of the NeuFit Undercurrent podcast. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review and be sure to subscribe to stay up to date as we release future episodes.